Alright, sorry about the abrupt end there, but I've recorded this video like 4 times, so we're just going to go with part 1 and part 2. So, part 2. Part 2 of this is, I was talking about Batman and sort of the change of him. So the idea there being that over generations, as you have these ongoing storylines, sometimes you need to adapt the character to make it more relevant to the current generation. So, as I had mentioned with Batman, in the 30s he was this pulp noir-driven character. In the 60s, he became this boffo bam zam hit 'em up thing that was more like the colorful romp 60s. In the 80s, he then transforms again and becomes, basically the image out of The Dark Knight Returns. And then in the 2000s, we get the Christopher Nolan Batman, it has to be set in the real world, right? Has to have like this very realistic element to it that we can imagine Batman living in our world, where none of the previous ones probably really did. So the point being is that I think that often the motivation for this can be to make the story or the characters or whatever actually meet with the current times, because as these things age and there's the weight of what they were weighing upon who they are, it can be hard to do that unless you do a clean break. And I think one example where Warhammer is sort of out of touch with the times that I could put my finger on is sort of the role of maybe women in the Warhammer world. There aren't a lot of armies that contain females in positive roles. Most of the time, if they're around, they're pretty much murderous psychopaths. So there are exceptions, of course, but just in general, the population of women in the game and in the stories as main characters or as playable units is fairly low. So I'm interested to see what you all think of whether or not that's at all relevant. Does Warhammer, the fluff as it's presented right now, does it feel in touch with the time? If you were 17 or 20 years old and looking to get into Warhammer, would you read this and would it resonate with you? I know that's kind of a hard question to ask, but I'm interested. So, give an example. So that's kind of comics and what I wanted to talk about with comics and their attempt at this. And one thing to point out is that most of the time in comics, this has been very successful. However, with role-playing games, the other half of what I want to talk about, there hasn't been near as much success. And I think part of that might be because with comics, you're just talking about the story. And also, there's a lot of continuity. Whereas with role-playing games, there's both story and rules. And oftentimes, these apocalyptic events need rules changes, as they are here as well. So let's talk about a couple instances of that. The first thing I'll bring up is the world Forgotten Realms. If you've ever played D&D, you've probably heard of the Forgotten Realms. It's one of the more popular settings for the game. It's now the default de facto setting for the game. It was created in the mid-'80s, or actually it was created well before that, but it became published, I guess is what I would say, in the mid-'80s by, originally written by Ed Greenwood, who still has a big hand in it even to this day. And it has went through several changes, usually timed with the edition changes of the game. The changes between first and second had this sort of big event, the Time of Troubles, which was impactful and important, but not really like completely world redefining, and it was generally positively accepted. Second and third just moved the timeline forward a little. But when we get to the fourth edition of Dungeons & Dragons, it was a very big change. The Forgotten Realms, the timeline advanced about 100 years, and there was a big change in the tone and texture of the realms. The world itself was adopted and sort of forced into this points of light concept that was floating around in D&D at the time. And I think overall the reaction to that was negative. And I think part of the reason for that is because there wasn't textual, tonal continuity between the two. What people saw as the value of the Forgotten Realms, the tone of the world, the sort of nature of the world, had been irrevocably altered by that change, by that advancement in timeline. So not only did you have a lot of important characters dying, which I think is irrelevant, but not as impactful. You still had a lot of big names around. Your big wizards and Dritz and people like this are still alive. They're certainly near immortal or going to live for a long, long time. They can take a century in stride. But the tone of the world which I think is important, especially to an RPG, was different. What does that mean for Warhammer? I think what it means for Warhammer is that whatever comes out the other side of this has to be tonally similar. And so for a little while there was a rumor that there was going to be a more steampunk flavor to the whole world. That has been more or less debunked, I believe, but that would have been a great example of how to screw it up. Because the world of Warhammer Fantasy is this dark, gritty, dank, gray world. You know, there's a picture in, like, the Bretonian book of this peasant archer looking all old and scabby and muddy and awful, malnourished, chewing on a hayseed. That is Warhammer right there. That image is the Warhammer fantasy world. If you've read a lot of fantasy, you know that there's like high fantasy and low fantasy and sword and sorcery stuff, all these things. That image is what Warhammer represents. Even the good guys are a little gray, the bad guys are a little sympathetic. Everything is dirty and bloody and, you know, awful. Not like 40K awful, which is beyond redemption. But, you know, no offense to 40K players. It's just you live in a grim world or a world of grim eternal war there. There's some redemption to this world. So that tonal continuity, I think, is very important. The next game I want to talk about, or the next RPG element, is Traveller. So Traveller was a science fiction RPG created in the late 70s. It's one of the first RPGs, period. Certainly one of the earliest sci-fi RPGs. And it was introduced, had very unique mechanics and stuff, which still resonate to this day. Very fun system. It's still being published, so I highly recommend you can go check it out if you're interested in sci-fi RPGs. But by the late 80s and early 90s, it had a problem. And it was effectively the same problem as we sort of addressed in comics, where it felt out of date. Traveller's a sci-fi game. It's supposed to be a far-flung future, yet what was being portrayed didn't look like a future that we still recognized. Even in 15 years, that didn't seem like the future anymore. So I'll give an easy example to make this more clear. You ever watch sci-fi movies from like the 1950s where everybody's in an allegedly a year that is either now or a few years back are wearing like silver outfits and eating food in pill form, and you know, we're flying through space, and you're like, I don't recognize that future. I think that's just not how the future will be. It certainly isn't how it is now, and probably won't be how the future is ever. By the time of Traveller, the new era, TNE, they realized that they were sort of out of sync with a potential future. And so they remade the whole system. They remade the rules, they remade the story, they changed a lot of stuff, and just kind of made these sweeping changes. Now, what's relevant to me about the Traveller story when it comes to Warhammer was the community impact. So Traveller, when it changed, split the community right down the middle, or at least as near to that as it can. I mean, I don't have survey data, but the response in my remembrance and estimation and reading back on it is that it was a pretty middle-of-the-road change. Some people really liked it, some people really hated it, and the community was split. That's always your worst-case scenario. What you're really looking for is 90-10 or 80-20 or something like that in one direction or the other. So what we want out of Warhammer, out of the next edition, is either it's good enough, interesting enough, whatever, that 80 to 90% of people are happy with it and adopt it. If that's the case, the other 10%, no matter how vocal they are, it doesn't matter. They will die away or go do their own thing and become a niche community, as every game edition change ever has created. That is simply part and parcel. You do not get 100% conversion rates. You will always get grognards. It is what happens. So that is a reality. And that's okay, because eventually that 10 to 20% can be recuperated by new players coming in, and it usually doesn't take too long. And even some of those people might eventually come back or be won over. The other great situation is 80 or 90% hate it and don't adopt it. You still have the community together, and frankly, a community united in hate or mutual revulsion of a thing is often just as effective as a community united around love of a thing. So for our purposes, it would be the same either way. The community would stay whole, good to go. 50-50, though, is the worst case. And that's if there's any fear I have in the next edition, it's this. Because it would be very easy to pitch to have a pretty decent edition that had split the community like this. And I think that's where it's going to rest partially on us as the community. We choose how we engage in the community. So if we want to be friendly about it and engage the other side of our opinion, then we can bridge that gap and we can say, hey, I'll play in a version of your game one week if you play this version the next week or whatever. Now, for tournaments, that it is what it is. You know, a tournament has a set of rules. You either like the rule pack or you don't. That's fine. But in the community, there's no reason we can't have a civil discussion about this and make the right choices, even if it does end up as a pretty contentious down the middle of the road thing. So that's sort of TNE. My final example with RPGs I want to give, I think, is the most relevant to Warhammer, and that is Dragonlance. So Dragonlance was sort of based on the series of novels out of the mid-'80s, the Autumn Twilight, and so on and so forth, that trilogy, or the Twins trilogy. If you've read those, familiar with them, they're a great series of books written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. And they created their own setting then within D&D, and it was very popular. However, by the twilight of 2nd edition, which is in the mid to late 90s, Dragonlance decided to update its story and simultaneously took this advantage to basically go off on its own and make its own rule set. So hence Dragonlance 5th Age. And 5th Age was very revolutionary for its time. In many ways, it was completely ahead of its time. It used cards instead of dice. It had a very strong narrative and creativity focus. It was very different than what had come before, and there aren't many things after that look the same. For a game designer like myself, or somebody who's like a true RPG nerd, it was a fascinating game because it's so unique, especially for its time. And it got critically hailed as being incredibly creative. The problem is that it got absolutely, I don't know what I want to say here. The community didn't like it. I'll try to avoid any really negative or naughty words in this. The community did not respond positively. They were nonplussed. And I think that part of the reason for that is because it's related to the thing that happened with Forgotten Realms, but not the same. Again, it happened after a cataclysm. Again, some time went by. It wasn't exactly, but like, you know, with Traveler and with Forgotten Realms is 100 years. The rumor with Warhammer is that it's going to be 100 years. I think we all just like the 100-year mark when we advance a storyline after an apocalyptic event, because that's sort of like our long vision of one full human lifetime. So I think we kind of all see that as like, that's how much you advance it. I wonder if there's like a subconsciousness there that everybody who was alive is dead, so we should pick that 100-year thing. Don't know. But anyway, time advanced, and the problem was that the world itself was still tonally the same. It was still the same type of fantasy world. But something more important had changed. The community that liked Dragonlance came to know Dragonlance through the characters of the novels and the nations and peoples that they were part of. And that's how we perceive the world. When all of those went away, so too did the community's connection to the world. And I think that's a more accurate representation of Warhammer. Okay? We, as a community, as players of Warhammer, have come to know Warhammer through the armies. We've talked before about the psychological investment in painting and making your own minis, but it goes deeper than that. We see ourselves in our armies. They represent some aspect of our psychographic profile in the way they play and the way they act, their personality in the world. They're us. You know, for me, I'm Skaven. I love those little sociopathic, crazy, scheming, conniving lunatics. That's me. And, you know, hey, maybe that reflects poorly on my personality as a whole, but I love those little rat dudes. And so when I read stuff in the world and I think of the Warhammer world, I see through their eyes, and I experience the world through their perception. Not alone. We all have a couple armies we do this with. And so it makes stories and changes to the world be perceived differently, because you see it through the eyes of the army or the instinct, the personality that you have. And so it's just an easy example. When we talk about the end times, if your army has spent the entirety of the end times, 5 books, getting its teeth absolutely kicked down its throat, you're probably not enjoying end times that much. Conversely, if you've spent the whole time winning and blew up the moon, you know, then you're probably having a pretty good time with the story. So I think that it's through those are our true connection point to the world, those armies. It's not just the rules. I think the rules honestly can shift quite a bit in a lot of ways, and people would still be attached. I think it's what makes it endure what makes Warhammer endure is our connection, our psychological, deeply embedded connection to those armies. When those start going away or shifting, things get dangerous. So I think the challenge for 9th edition is not to preserve the armies of the nations exactly, or the units, because the units really don't matter. Go back and look at 3rd, 4th edition empires. There's Kislev horse archers and halflings and ogres in that book, and there's no steam tanks or hellblaster volley guns or anything like that. Now when you look at an empire army in 8th edition, there's a couple steam tanks rumbling around, might be an entire line of 1-up cav and demigryphs and other nonsense. Celestial hurricanes driving around and crazy crap like that. It has nothing, you wouldn't even know it was the same army if you transported someone who played a 3rd or 4th edition empire army to the future. Unless there happened to be like a block of Empire halberdiers, state troops, who were painted in the same color scheme. So I think that the units and things like that, those little elements can change, but the Empire is still the Empire. When we look at it, there's this characterful connection that I can trace the line throughout the history of Warhammer and say that's who they are. And it's not entirely to do with Karl Franz or Marcus or Leitdorf or whoever the other guys are in there. I think it has to do with the character of the Empire, of the army. So what's going to be important is when the new edition comes around, can most of the players, not all, there's always going to be some who can't, but can most of the players look at what's available and say, that's me. That's my thing. I liked this thing before, this style, this theme, and I see that in the offerings here. I don't think we have a good answer to that yet, even like a rumor that really touches on that. But I think that's going to ultimately be the big litmus test, is can we see those things? If we can, then the edition will be successful. If we can't, well, then it's more questionable. So, that's my talk. Again, sorry for the interruption in the middle. Thanks for watching through part 1 and part 2. I really appreciate it. As always, this is a discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think about what I said below, so please leave your comments. I always try to respond to everything. Subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed. Like if you like it. But in any case, thanks a lot for listening. Really appreciate it. Look forward to the discussion, and see you next time.